Imagine a void so vast it swallows 12 million human beings, leaving a continent scarred for centuries. This was not a natural disaster, but a calculated, global industry that reshaped the world forever. Before the chains, there were empires of gold and wisdom, civilizations that rivaled any in Europe. How did these thriving societies become the hunting grounds for the greatest forced migration in human history? Today, we peel back the layers of the transatlantic slave trade's dark origins and lasting impact. Before the first European ships appeared on the horizon, West Africa was a tapestry of sophisticated states. The Kingdom of Benin, the Oyo Empire, and the Ashanti Confederacy flourished with complex legal systems and vibrant trade. Their markets were filled with bronze, ivory, and textiles that were envied across the globe. These were not primitive tribes, but highly organized societies with rich intellectual traditions. However, the arrival of foreign steel and gunpowder would soon ignite a fire that consumed the continent's stability. In the 15th century, Portuguese explorers originally sought a sea route to the legendary gold mines of West Africa. For decades, they traded peacefully with local monarchs, exchanging European goods for gold, pepper, and ivory. But the discovery of the Americas changed everything. Suddenly, the demand for labor on sugar plantations in the New World turned human beings into the most profitable commodity. The focus shifted from the wealth of the land to the strength of the people who inhabited it. The construction of Elmina Castle in 1482 marked a turning point. Initially built as a trading post for gold, it soon became a warehouse for human souls. Massive stone walls rose against the Atlantic waves, hiding the horrors that would take place within. These fortresses, known as factories, dotted the West African coastline from Senegal to Nigeria. They were the final point of contact for millions of Africans before they were forced onto ships, never to see their ancestral homes again. Slavery existed in Africa before Europeans arrived, but the transatlantic trade was a different, more brutal beast. Traditional African slavery often allowed for social mobility or eventual freedom. The European demand, however, introduced chattel slavery, where people were treated as property for life. This insatiable hunger for labor destabilized local politics, as kingdoms were forced to choose between participating in the trade or becoming its victims. The introduction of firearms by European traders only accelerated this cycle of violence. As the trade intensified, the geography of West Africa was permanently altered. Coastal states grew powerful by acting as middlemen, while the interiors were systematically raided. Entire communities moved their villages to inaccessible hills or swamps to escape the slave catchers. The social fabric of families was torn apart as young, healthy men and women were targeted. This demographic drain left many regions vulnerable, halting the natural progression of their economies and leaving a legacy of fear that would last for generations. The capturing process was a descent into hell. Most victims were taken during wars or specialized kidnapping raids. Once captured, they were marched for hundreds of miles toward the coast, bound together by heavy wooden yokes and iron chains. Many did not survive the journey, their bodies left along the paths of the interior. For those who reached the sea, the sight of the massive stone fortresses and the endless ocean was a terrifying realization of a fate worse than death. Upon reaching the coast, the captives were held in dark, suffocating dungeons beneath the trade castles. These rooms, often carved directly into the rock, held hundreds of people in unsanitary conditions. The heat was unbearable, and the air was thick with the scent of disease and despair. Here, they were branded with hot irons, marking them as the property of specific European companies. This was the systematic stripping of identity, transforming warriors, mothers, and craftsmen into mere numbers on a ledger. The door of no return was the final threshold. It was a narrow portal leading from the dungeons directly to the beach or the waiting boats. Passing through this door meant the permanent loss of one's family, culture, and language. The psychological trauma of this moment is impossible to overstate. As they stepped onto the sand, many grabbed the final handful of African soil, a desperate attempt to hold onto a piece of the world they were being forced to leave. The Middle Passage was a journey of pure horror that lasted several months. Captives were packed into the holds of ships with less space than a coffin. They lay in darkness, chained together, as the vessel tossed on the Atlantic waves. Seasickness, dysentery, and smallpox spread rapidly through the cramped quarters. The mortality rate was staggering, with nearly 15% of the captives dying before reaching the Americas. The ocean became a vast graveyard for those who did not survive. Resistance was a constant thread throughout the history of the trade. On the ships, captives frequently organized uprisings, attempting to seize control of the vessels and return home. Some chose the ultimate form of defiance, jumping into the shark-infested waters rather than facing a life of enslavement. These acts of bravery were a reminder that the human spirit cannot be easily broken. In West Africa, entire villages rose up against local leaders who collaborated with European traders, leading to internal revolutions. The Triangle Trade created a global economic system that fueled the industrialization of Europe. Ships left Europe with manufactured goods, exchanged them in Africa for people, and then sold those people in the Americas for raw materials like sugar, tobacco, and cotton. This cycle generated immense wealth for European nations while systematically draining West Africa of its most productive citizens. The economic disparity we see today has its roots in this centuries-long extraction of human capital and resources from the African continent. By the 18th century, the Kingdom of Dahomey had become a major player in the trade. Their military power was formidable, featuring the famous Agoji, an all-female regiment of elite warriors. Dahomey's economy became so dependent on the slave trade that ending it posed a significant existential threat to their state. This highlights the tragic complexity of the era. The trade had become so deeply embedded in the political structures of West Africa that it was difficult for any single kingdom to withdraw. In Nigeria, the Bight of Benin and the Bight of Biafra were major departure points. The Igbo and Yoruba peoples were among the most affected ethnic groups. The loss of so many people led to a significant shift in gender roles and community structures. With so many men taken, women often took on traditionally male roles in agriculture and governance. The cultural impact was profound, as traditional religious practices and oral histories were adapted to make sense of the mass disappearances and the surrounding chaos. The scale of the trade is difficult to comprehend. Experts estimate that for every person who reached the Americas alive, several others died during capture, the inland trek, or the Middle Passage. This massive loss of life stunted West Africa's population growth for centuries. While other parts of the world saw their populations explode during the industrial era, Africa's remained stagnant. This demographic freeze had long-term consequences for the continent's ability to develop its own industrial base and defend against future colonization. Despite the attempts to strip them of their humanity, Africans carried their cultures across the Atlantic. In the Americas, elements of Yoruba, Igbo, and Akan traditions survived and evolved. Music, religion, and culinary practices from West Africa laid the foundations for modern cultures in the Caribbean, Brazil, and the United States. This cultural resilience is a testament to the strength of the African heritage, which refused to be extinguished even under the most brutal conditions of the plantation system in the New World. The abolitionist movement began to gain momentum in the late 18th century. Influenced by Enlightenment ideas and the horrific accounts of former slaves like Oloda Equiano, public opinion in Britain started to shift. Equiano, an Igbo man who purchased his own freedom, wrote a best-selling autobiography that exposed the true nature of the trade to the European public. His voice, and the voices of many others, challenged the economic arguments for slavery with powerful moral and humanitarian pleas for justice. In 1807, the British Parliament passed the Abolition of the Slave Trade Act. While this did not end slavery itself, it made the transportation of people across the Atlantic illegal for British subjects. The Royal Navy's West Africa Squadron was formed to patrol the coast and intercept illegal slave ships. However, the trade continued in secret for decades, driven by high demand in Brazil and Cuba. The transition from a slave-based economy to legitimate trade in palm oil and cocoa was slow and painful. The end of the slave trade did not bring immediate peace to West Africa. Instead, it paved the way for the era of formal colonization. European powers, who had previously been content with coastal outposts, now sought to control the interior resources of the continent. The infrastructure and military technology developed during the slave trade era were now turned toward conquest. The scramble for Africa in the late 19th century was, in many ways, the final chapter of the disruption started by the Atlantic trade. Today, the physical remnants of the trade serve as somber memorials. Sites like the Badagry slave port in Nigeria and the castles in Ghana attract thousands of visitors who come to pay their respects to the ancestors. These locations are not just museums, they are sacred ground. They remind us of a time when the world's economy was built on the suffering of a specific race, and they challenge us to recognize the modern forms of exploitation that still exist in our global society. The legacy of the transatlantic slave trade is also one of incredible connection. The African diaspora has created a global community that remains linked by shared history and heritage. From the rhythms of jazz and reggae to the religious practices of Santeria and Candombo, the influence of West Africa is visible everywhere. This enduring connection serves as a bridge across the Atlantic, reuniting families and cultures that were once violently torn apart by the greed of empires and merchant companies. To understand modern Africa, one must understand the scars left by this era. The political instability and economic challenges faced by many West African nations are not accidental, they are the result of centuries of systemic extraction and disruption. However, the story does not end in tragedy. Across the continent, there is a powerful movement to reclaim the narrative, to celebrate the empires that existed before the trade, and to build a future that honors the resilience of those who survived the Middle Passage. The concept of Sankofa, a word from the Akan people of Ghana, means we must go back and fetch what we forgot. It teaches us that the past is a source of wisdom for the future. By confronting the dark history of the transatlantic slave trade, we gain the tools to dismantle the prejudices and inequalities that still haunt our world. We honor the 12 million not just by mourning their loss, but by telling their full story, as kings, mothers, and pioneers. The history of the transatlantic slave trade is not merely a chronicle of suffering, but a testament to the enduring spirit of West Africa. From the ruins of the slave castles to the vibrant cities of modern Nigeria, the journey continues. We must remember this past to safeguard our future, ensuring that such a tragedy never repeats. Thank you for walking through this dark corridor of history with us. Please subscribe to keep exploring the untold stories of Africa's powerful and complex legacy.